Hello and welcome to Data Conversations over Coffee with myself, Craig Stewart. Today is a pretty important episode. It's myself and my guest, Nanda, are under some immense pressure here because it's been a very highly anticipated episode, judging by the traction that we've got on LinkedIn when I promoted it last week. Nanda, you won't know this, but nearly 10,000 people have viewed the post. Nearly 200 people have liked it, loads of comments. So we've got our work cut out for us to deliver something special. But I know it'll be easy. You're really passionate about this space. We're talking all things about ethics in AI. I know it's a super hot topic at the moment. Everybody's really grappling with how to get AI into their organizations, and then obviously making sure that there's ethical considerations around that it's not biased, it's fair, etc. So look, I'm no expert, but Nanda Padayachee from Standard Bank is joining me. Nanda, it's good to have you. You're the head of AI, automation, and APIs. Let's maybe dig into that a little bit first, because that's a fairly important job title and remit that you've
got. Thanks, Craig, and it's a pleasure to be with you again. And very eager for the conversation and excited that so many people are expressing an interest in what's such an important topic and will increasingly become a more and more important topic. I guess, the makeup of my role at present is quite interesting. I think, it's partly a reflection of, every organization is trying to make rapid progress and accelerate their ambitions around digitization, digital business models, etc. And we see these being critical accelerators in the realization of that ambition. And we've sort of come to the conclusion that there's such a dynamic interplay between these components, where actually what you're trying to do is create, use these emergent technologies in a really substantive, pervasive way to power customer experiences and create differentiation. And so, it's sort of been almost a year now that we've brought these capabilities together, and we're already seeing there's such a dynamic interplay. Whether it's how you're taking traditional RPA, robotic process automation, infusing that with AI type capabilities, or even if you're taking and building custom machine learning models that you need to deploy as an API through an endpoint. So it's such a dynamic interplay around that. And I think increasingly we're seeing that, this trifecta needs to come together, underpinned by, everything we're trying to do from a client engagement perspective. So it's a very exciting portfolio, challenging because, we'll talk around this a little bit more. We're trying to move at pace, and not everything you need is always there. And so you have to create some boundaries. You have to impose boundaries in other conditions. It's an exciting space to be in, and very privileged to work with a very talented team and colleagues across the organization who are super passionate around doing the right thing for our clients.
Yeah, and I think the conversations I've had with people from various areas in Standard Bank over the last couple of months, it really does seem like as an organization, you're very data driven and in a very collaborative, holistic way. I mean, I'd imagine something like trying to put in AI, automation, APIs, there's a lot of different departments that you need to pull from. And it seems like everybody's pretty much on the same page, you're all on the same team to get this stuff done to the value of your customers, obviously.
No, absolutely. I think, one of the big recognitions, and, this plays out, everywhere, is that this is not something that can be done alone. In DC Comics, they have this. They have all these different superheroes. You've got Aquaman and Superman, and their last poster was "You can't save the world alone." And it's really the same around all of these, all of these massive topics. Is that it does require, uber collaboration, people putting their ego aside to do what's right for the organization and clients. And we're very fortunate to have that kind of dynamic in the organization. But more broadly in the industry, I think even just the events that you pulled together shows that people are open. They want to share. They realize that we've got to progress this together for not just our own benefit or the benefit of our organizations, but how do we solve this for the country? How do we solve this for the continent? And how do we all make a contribution towards it? So it's a great spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. It really fits that sort of mantra around, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And as you say, like the whole industry is happy to help each other, share knowledge, etc., which I think is a testament to all of us. that have been able to do that. So, all right, let's then get into the big topic of the day. Ethics in AI. There's a lot of uncertainty outside of, I guess, people who really understand and are implementing AI. As to how safe is it, how fair is it, are they going to take jobs, or is AI going to kind of take over the world? When I'm going to reach that point of singularity? Everybody's seen the movies, and I actually saw something. I was doing some research for this, and I saw that there's been movies that have included AI since 1927, some form of artificial intelligence. So it's been around for a long time, and that fear mongering amongst the general public has kind of grown. People don't actually understand the value that it's having in the background for how they do their banking, their online shopping, whatever it may be. But there are ethical considerations around this. And I guess where I wanted to kick off with this is, what comes first? Do you put in the ethical considerations before you actually start developing AI within your organization, or do you still have to go and industrialize, operationalize, get all the platforms, etc., together, the data, and then maybe overlay the ethics into that? So let's maybe kick off with there. Where do you kind of start? How do you suggest to people that they get started on this journey?
So maybe we'll dial into that a little bit as we progress. Maybe a good starting point is that if you reflect on cycles around innovation, typically, you typically have a scenario where there's some innovation. That innovation starts to get democratized, and then only over time, as the democratization of that capability starts to increase, do we start to think around responsibility. And there's two good examples that come to mind. The first is like motor cars. So if you think of how long motor cars have been around for, since the 40s as an example. To the point of when it became mainstream and more people started consuming and making use of that as a mode of transport, to the point of when it became a legislative requirement to wear a seatbelt. That cycle from when the motor car was invented to when seatbelts became compulsory is almost a 50, 60-year cycle. And, even in some countries, it's not compulsory to wear a seatbelt if you're at the back of the vehicle, etc. And so we typically see this cycle playing out where, there's such a significant lag between the innovation, the democratization, and then responsibility becomes an afterthought. We see the same thing with even, more modern, innovations like the internet as an example. It's only over the course of, the last year or two with GDPR, and now everybody has to go click a button that says accept cookies. What was happening in 30 years before that everybody was consuming the internet. And one of the key thoughts that I've been reflecting on is a great quote by a biologist by trade, George Bernard Shaw, and he talks around that as a society, we're at the point where we have access to godlike technology, we have medieval institutions, and we have Paleolithic emotions, if you subscribe to evolutionary theory. And I think, but it beautifully puts all these compounding forces that are coming together that we're going to have to contend with. And I think the reality is, artificial intelligence in one sense is unlike any technology that we've experienced in the past. And we can't afford a 40, 50, 60-year lag to figure out, well, how do we do this responsibly? And I think, that's one of the key things that's emerging in a very deliberate way is that, there's more and more pressure that as this leaves the door, both in the people who are creating this technology and the people that are consuming that to create, experiences, products, services, that how do we do this in a more responsible way? But I think the reality is that, we're really at the start of the journey. In one sense, we're the first generation to experience artificial intelligence outside of a lab. And so, that comes with, and so I think, there has to be recognition of that point. And as you said, there's so much, hysteria, hype, confusion, and we try and tone down the conversation in focusing on, when you talk AI more broadly, you have to make a distinction between narrow artificial intelligence, which is realistically where we are as a society today. Any AI that's created, any model that's created solves a very bespoke, very particular purpose. You can't take the DeepMind AI capability that played AlphaGo, and that's the same AI that's playing StarCraft. It's a completely different scenario, depending on completely different data, etc. And whether we ever get to artificial general intelligence, that's a whole different debate. And people who are far more wise and experienced than me, they all have conflicting opinions from 30 years to 300 years to never.
Yeah.
But I think where we have an ability to exercise some control is in narrow artificial intelligence, and how we deploy and how we start to create that. And so, and we're starting to see, and there's some really nice frameworks that are starting to emerge around this. There was one published last year by the European Union High-Level Commission around artificial intelligence, and just the fact that a committee like that in forum exists, it also starts to give you a sense that governments also starting to take this in a much more serious context. And there's really two key points that stand out. The first is that we have to be very deliberate around what is the purpose as to why are we deploying this AI. And we've got to ensure that's for an ethical and rightful and just purpose, and that's the first starting point. And that then evolves into, well, if our purpose is correct, how do we ensure the technical soundness around this, both in terms of its deployment, in terms of its upkeep, and in terms of, AI by nature is adaptable within certain parameters, and how do we ensure that the way it adapts continues to align with that purpose. So, maybe those are some opening thoughts around that, even though I've taken half the time.
No, it's good. It really sets the scene. So that's interesting there. I think, as you say, and I think that's where people are, not people in the industry per se, but people outside of the industry get confused, is that, this AI is this robot that will take over. But really what it does is it solves, it takes over processes that are very specific within an organization, whether it be, in a fraud environment or understanding a customer better. It works well in a call center environment. So as you said, it's very narrow sort of function for it, and can effectively then be controlled and used for a good purpose. But just those two things that you say. So the purpose of what you're using it for needs to be right and just. Okay, who makes that decision? That's a very philosophical sort of debate around that. But then there's the technical soundness, as you say, around it. It's a learning thing, but it has to be taught. It has to get set on that path, fed data, etc. So a lot of pressure on the developers, the data scientists, people developing that, coming up with the rules. How do you kind of manage that? You've got different personalities in your organization. You've got a different understanding of what right and just may mean. How do you kind of set the boundaries of that within an AI model?
So there's a couple of things that are really important around this. One is, AI doesn't exist within a vacuum. So the culture, the purpose of an organization, the values of an organization, the behavior of people in any organization play an immense role in bringing this together. So I think that's the first point. The point around purpose then has to, in any responsible organization would have a purpose that, at least in this day and age, is beyond just, is beyond just, pure capitalism. Every organization now is, embracing stakeholder capitalism. What's the role of the impact of what we do in society? What's the impact in terms of, the environment and all these other, ESG factors that are becoming more pronounced. So the purpose around that has to be anchored to a purpose within an organization. What we try and do is create, we use the term of a playbook or a toolbox that creates the boundaries for how we deploy any capability within the organization, and particularly so here. And what we have tried to do, because as you said, it can become a little bit philosophical, we've tried to anchor this to almost an AI manifesto within our organization. It says, right, the principles around how we want to use AI in our organization are anchored around these points. And typically, and some of the points that we focus on is that it's there to empower client experiences. Our focus is much more around amplifying human ingenuity. It's not around, we're going to use AI and suddenly, we're going to need half the employees that we need in the organization. The reality is, where AI is in its current cycle is very much a human in the loop type process. And how do we cater for that? Anybody in a development context would know that, one of the biggest challenges in software development is not developing the software, it's figuring out what is the right software to develop and does it meet the requirements. And so, from that perspective, the human in the loop becomes a massive factor. From a technical soundness perspective, we've been quite deliberate over, now an extended period, almost 3 to 4 years, around putting down what our minimum requirements are around any AI capability that we deploy, from the monitoring and logging, the technical soundness, the accuracy of the data that you use as inputs into that process, who takes responsibility for that on an ongoing basis. And it's gone to the extent, and it was really encouraging that this was a process that was led by by our CEO in the organization around any model that we're deploying that has a substantial machine learning, that has material implications, has to go through our traditional model review committees where there's formal structures within the organization, etc. So things that have implications on things like capital, risk, or that would have pervasive implications. It's not just, well, I'm a developer, I build this and I'm going to deploy that. Depending on the scale and the implications around that, there are various levels of governance associated with that. But the one other point that I wanted to make around this that you touched on earlier is, I think there's big danger around this topic that AI in one sense is becoming more and more invisible. And I think that's a real danger for society at large, in the sense that, there was a really interesting research study that was done by Pega in the US. It may have been last year or the year before last. And they polled, a couple of thousand people. And the question they posed to them was, how, do you engage with artificial intelligence? And a third of the people said yes. A third of the people said no, and a third of the people said they don't know. So if you say two-thirds of people in this exercise had no idea that they were engaging with artificial intelligence. So then when you break it down to them and say, well, your spam filter in your email is driven by artificial intelligence. Your shopping recommendations on Amazon or Takealot or wherever is informed by artificial intelligence. Your autocorrect on your spelling is informed by artificial intelligence. Your maps is informed by this. When you do live chat with an agent, that's typically artificial intelligence. And I think we have to be far more deliberate, I think, as a community in making more visible when we are using artificial intelligence, because in the absence of that, consumers then divest their rights to engage in a conversation. They divest from, well, my news feed and what I'm seeing is controlled by some algorithm. What am I not seeing? And we take away that ability to answer that question. We just get sucked into this, I'm a consumer of this. And I think as a society, we perhaps, in our trade-off and choices, are perhaps trading off too liberally around convenience, without considering the full implications of what are we giving up in response to that. And there will always be a trade-off, but I think we have to make more deliberate choices, and people need to be more aware around what are they actually choosing in the trade-offs, implication in those trade-offs.
So I think in that point, you talk about what your news feed looks like, whether you're talking about Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram, any form of social media, really, it's all based on an algorithm, and the user actually is the one inputting and training that model at all times. If you're liking certain types of things, then those certain types of things will actually come up. And I think people don't understand that that's how a lot of that comes about. And obviously, if AI is making decisions around credit, loans, all those sorts of things, even recommendation engines or new products, there needs to be, I guess, a level of, or an ability to explain the AI to the lay person. And I know that must be a fairly strong part of the ethics debate, is that, can I explain it to the lay person who really doesn't have a technical background? They say, how come you keep sending me these things? How is that explainability built into the model?
Yeah, it's a great point, and one of the areas where there is still substantive weakness around the way AI is consumed today is that, if we look at the main advances in AI in the last decade have been driven through machine learning, and the explainability around that is a real challenge. What we've seen, which we've done, and we're aware that other organizations do similar, is that given some of the limitations around that, you then don't deploy, you have to be, again, cautious, not just the purpose, but around the explainability as well. So if you're using this, in a to flag a fraudulent transaction, and the customer says, well, why was this deemed fraudulent? And you can't explain that to a customer. That actually creates a context where it creates, friction in the customer experience, and then we wouldn't deploy AI in that context. But what we're seeing at the moment is that people are building, these machine learning models, these AI models, and using it as input alongside traditional models. So it becomes another data point into a decision-making process rather than the singular de facto mechanism. The second thing is that you overlay that with human in the loop, so that there's still some oversight around some of these processes that exist. But we have to be, as the people who deploy this capability, the people who invent these capabilities, there has to be a much greater effort around explainability. It's a real weak point. And second to that is also, as you mentioned, you get trapped into these bubbles that exist as you start consuming this. So even if you take, your Netflix feed, and if you wanted to find movie recommendations outside of what your current profile dictates, there's no mechanism to do that. And there has to be a mechanism to reset, or, okay, what are other people seeing? We can't just get sucked into these echo chambers, because I think, we've already seen the broad implications that play out around that. So, there is, I think, one of the key things that, every leader involved in the space has responsibility for, is to understand the capabilities that exist around any technology and capability. We're talking here, AI, but it could be any technology. And what are the inherent limitations around it? It's not just, you're going to go gung-ho around all of this without, considering the implications, what are the drawbacks, what are the things that we've got to introduce compensating controls around, because the technology can't solve everything for us. And we have to be very deliberate around the choices that we make here.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask you, and it kind of goes to that, is that there's one part of being unethical in AI is maliciously and purposely unethical. Hackers, if we think about things like the Cambridge Analytica, election scandal, etc. There's that part of it, but there must be an element of being accidentally unethical. It's just a natural bias comes in, or sort of a lack of understanding, or maybe some of the data going in is slightly incorrect, and over time it kind of leads to unethical behavior, decisions. And I'm not talking really seriously unethical things, but maybe just things that are slightly incorrect. How do you manage that? I mean, it must be a lot of maintenance over time and just constant checks and balances.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we've seen is that it's going to require different to use AI responsibly and pervasively in organizations. It's going to require a change in behavior and a change in thinking. Typically, if we look at, what we do with software, analytics, etc., we have all the energy goes into the creation of this, and maintenance, just as human beings, maintenance is not something we're particularly good at. We get excited around, starting something, we're excited about a new relationship, we're excited around, starting a new venture. And then the work that we've got to do to maintain that posture, to maintain those habits that we want to create, we really struggle around. And I think this is going to be a significant challenge, as organizations adopt AI, is that, I often talk around, it's like you have a child. If you bring a child into this world, you can't just bring the child into the world and then, you don't feed it, you don't train, you don't educate, you don't care for the upkeep. Yeah. And it's the same around these capabilities. It's the same around these capabilities, because it's adaptive, because it's autonomous, because you're constantly feeding it data. You have to be very deliberate on an ongoing basis as to, is it still behaving in the bounds as to what we expect? Yeah. It can't just be, we deploy this and we move on to the next thing. And I think, this is something that organizations will find different, because anybody who's been involved in software development will tell you, we've got, more, mountains of technical debt, far more technical debt than working code. We can't afford to end up in that same scenario around AI. We have to be very purposeful, very deliberate, and keep a constant eye around that. Yeah. But it also talks to the point around diversity within AI teams, because, data has inherent biases. And human beings have inherent biases. We may have more biases than potentially AI does, because it picks up those biases from what it experiences through data that we've created, through what we've trained on. So, having those diverse teams, become really important in terms of the data sets that we train it on, picking up conscious and unconscious biases that may exist around that. And what is encouraging is, we're now starting to see some tooling around some of these capabilities, where you can put your model through a process and say, okay, at least in a very obtuse sense, can you pick up, things that are, extreme outliers in the process? As you say, we're always going to be flirting with the edge, in certain scenarios, whether intentionally or unintentionally. But I think, yeah, we have to, the analogy that I mentioned earlier around, the seatbelt coming 60 years later, we can't afford for this to take place here because of the rate at which the technology is evolving.
Yeah.
And I think, that's why the consumer activism in this space also becomes important. If we think of the step backs people have taken around, use of facial recognition as an example, it's not because people don't want to use the technology, it's because of the increasing vocalism around, general public around, this is just not acceptable. We can't have a 40% accuracy for a large demographic that exists within, certain countries and constituencies.
Yeah. I mean, I think the general, our generation now is a lot more sensitive to these things than they were maybe, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s. I mean, I remember as a kid spending loads of time in the car with no seatbelt and stuff. No disregard to my parents. They're wonderful parents. But I mean, even as it is the 80s and 90s, these things happen. But I think people are more sensitive to it now. And there's a bigger voice. Now with social media and everything, you just, companies can't afford to get this stuff wrong because it's going to be on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn so quickly. And that shouldn't be the driver. The fear of getting it wrong and being caught out shouldn't be the driver. I mean, the whole point of ethics is that, doing the right thing when nobody's watching, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it also, there's such an interesting dynamic that will continue to play out around, and it's a point you touched on earlier, is around how aggressively do you pursue this, or do you wait for these to become more mature? And I think the reality is, there's no technology that will ever cater for, every single scenario and be foolproof in terms of, what it can do. But and I think that's why there's such a positive agenda around AI in one context. Even if you look at and it's still in its infancy, but the potential around this particular technology to reduce some of the gaps that exist around inequality. So whether it's around things like access to education or access to healthcare, and through things like telemedicine or access to finance, because I don't have a 30-year credit record. I've just now with a thin file of data, how do I get access to credit? How do I improve my life through that basis? So we have to find equilibrium between managing the risks, but also the potential around what this could do in a really mainstream context around improving the lives of people. Particularly, Africa is the quantum continent. We've seen, the impact of, things like mobile telephony, etc. And, even something like agriculture is an example. If we think of how much agriculture takes place in the continent, even, with just simple solutions that have, some component of intelligence linked to weather data, linked to harvesting, linked to price points, it creates these virtuous circles that give people access to opportunities that otherwise would have been very difficult to realize. So we are going to have this constant tension between deploying this in a responsible context, the broad stream positive impacts that can emerge, and at the same time people not exploiting this in a in a negative context, because that is also the reality that exists.
Yeah.
If you look at blockchain as an example, I joke with some of my colleagues that the most pervasive use of blockchain at the moment is to collect ransomware, and that's not what the purpose of the technology is.
Yeah.
And we have to be far more deliberate around this.
Yeah. All right, Nanda, there's so much. I mean, I've got calls coming up, and this is for everybody watching as well, around ethics in AI with the Human Research Sciences Council, Rachel Adams, based in Cape Town, with the World Economic Forum and the Alan Turing Institute as well over the next few weeks. So really taking a deep dive into the ethical side of AI. And what I'll do is sort of mid-September, I'll get all four of you onto a panel podcast, and we can kind of sum up everything that's been talked about and share some ideas. Before I let you go, I've got two more questions. First one, if we could maybe ask you to just quickly summarize, what are the three key things that you would sort of say to any organization who's embarking on their AI journey that they need to kind of really keep top of mind when they're developing the AI models and the ethical side of that?
Sure. So I think the first thing is that, we can't be, AI is not a bandwagon we want to jump on. we have to be very deliberate as to what problem statement or opportunity statement we're trying to solve within the organization around it, and then that creates the context for it. It shouldn't be, it shouldn't be a keeping up with anything type exercise. I need to do AI. I'm going to fall behind if I don't do that. We have to be really deliberate around doing that. Secondly, is the need for diverse teams to be involved in the creation of AI, from the people framing the problem statement, conceiving the solutions, how we productize the AI, what the data is that's consumed in the AI, how we build the models, how we ensure that's consumed, run, and managed on an ongoing basis, and that we set that up as an ongoing concern and not a project that we're spiking for 6 months and then we move on to the next project. Yeah. It has to be set up intentionally with longevity associated with that. The third is, I think, there's the technology is moving quickly, and people are starting to introduce at least some mitigating controls or make it easier for people to detect, flaws in the process of building AI. And so, that consuming those technologies that can also help mitigate where you may not have direct skills, competence, etc., to detect bias, also becomes important. And maybe, the fourth one I'd add is to be very deliberate around if in the way that you're wanting to deploy AI doesn't hold up to the way that you deploy any other capability, then don't deploy the AI. Okay. Because it's AI, shouldn't have a separate set of criteria as to we go to market with this because it's AI and we're going to do this that wouldn't meet the same threshold that you would for any other capability that you'd introduce in the organization.
Oh, good. Well, that's a good bonus point there for everyone as well. Make sure it fits with the company ethos and philosophy. Nanda, last one before I let you go. Tea or coffee? I'm obviously sipping my tea coffee as we go through. What's your sort of hot drink of choice?
I disappoint you that it'll be neither. I don't generally do hot drinks. I don't have caffeine or any form of any form of intoxicants, but I do enjoy hot milk.
Okay.
So I try and have hot milk regularly, either breakfast or in the evening, and sometimes I'll indulge in a white hot chocolate if I'm
risky.
If I'm being liberal.
Nice one. Yeah, I must admit I'm spending a lot of drinking a lot more sort of like a lemon infusion with turmeric and ginger and stuff, just more on the health side of things.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it really can have a powerful effect on the body.
Yeah.
So I think you've got a good recipe. All the antiseptics. So especially with the climate that we have, we all need to strengthen our immune systems as much as we can.
Absolutely. Nanda, it's been great chatting to you. Thank you so much. I think we absolutely 100% lived up to the expectations, certainly met mine, in terms of digging into such a great topic. I mean, it's something that can be debated and talked about and philosophized upon for hours. So what I'll do, as I said, I'll do the other episodes around this, and then I'll bring all four of you together as some sort of ethics and AI panel, just to kind of close up the loop on this.
Yeah, that'll be great. We're really looking forward to hearing the other conversations.
Yeah, great stuff. Nanda, thanks so much. We'll chat soon.